Well, let's start with the question, who wrote Mark's Gospel? At first glance it may seem a strange question to ask. Well, obviously Mark wrote it, but who was Mark? That's a much harder question to answer than it may seem at first glance. We know that there wasn't a Mark among the 12 disciples that Jesus chose. There were many people called Mark in the first century. It was a very common name. Perhaps the most likely candidate for our Mark is John Mark, who is written about in the book of Acts. John Mark was the cousin of Barnabas, who was a key team member in Paul's missionary team. Paul had a group of people with him as he travelled all around the Mediterranean region, spreading the good news of Christianity. And Barnabas went with Paul, and we know that John Mark went with Paul and Barnabas as well during one of the legs of what became known as Paul's first missionary journey. So John Mark was a missionary, and as a cousin of Barnabas, he was also a Jew. So he would have had a very good understanding of the Jewish scriptures, the prophecies concerning the coming of the Christ that we'll come to in just a few moments' time. And we know too that he probably came from Cyprus. So perhaps that's who John Mark was, the Mark that wrote the Gospel of Mark. And if our Mark is John Mark, then we know too that this man had an association with Jerusalem. And that's significant because Jerusalem was the place where Peter was based. Peter, the highest profile of all the disciples of Jesus, recognised as a key figure in the early church. And traditionally, it's thought that Mark is presenting us with Peter's gospel. So Mark is presenting to us Peter's own slant on the Christian faith, Peter's own understanding of what Jesus came to teach and to do. Perhaps the image we should have in our minds is of Peter dictating the words of the gospel to Mark as he furiously scribbled on his papyrus. Or perhaps Mark, just through his association with Peter, picked up Peter's own particular emphases and incorporated them into his account of Jesus' life. One thing that we can be reasonably sure of is that Mark was the first of the Gospels to be written. It's the earliest account of the life of Jesus. Now, that wasn't always thought to be the case. For very many years, people assumed that Matthew was the earliest of the Gospels, so that the order of the Gospels in our Bibles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, indicates what people historically thought about the order in which these texts were authored. Now, by and large, people are agreed that Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, and Matthew and Luke made use of Mark as one of their key sources, along with another source that's been lost to us. And there's something about Mark's language that supports the idea that we're dealing with a very early account of Jesus' life. Mark is very blunt, he's very matter-of-fact. There's very little theologizing that goes on in Mark's Gospel. And Mark doesn't seem particularly interested in setting out a straightforward biography of Jesus' life. He doesn't seem interested in setting out a biography in the way that we would understand that term today. He understands that Jesus' baptism happens at the beginning of Jesus' ministry and that Jesus' death and resurrection happen at the end, but everything in between is a bit of a muddle for Mark. It's a bit of, well, whatever. He's not particularly interested in particular times and particular places, in getting his details bang on. He's very unlike Luke in that regard. And when you read Luke's Gospel, you'll see that Luke was very intent in getting his details just right. Mark, by contrast, is very vague about times and places and geographical locations. So what then is Mark's agenda? He doesn't seem particularly interested in setting out a straightforward biographical account of what happened when and getting things in the correct sequential order. What is Mark wanting to accomplish through the writing of his gospel? What response is he looking for from his readers? Well, I think there's a clue in the line with which Mark starts his gospel. He starts his gospel this way in Mark chapter 1, verse 1. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Mark says three things there that are really interesting. He refers firstly to Jesus, the central figure's earthly name. This is a gospel all about Jesus. This account is all about Jesus, this remarkable, extraordinary person. And he says Jesus was the Christ. That's the Greek word for the Messiah, the long-awaited one, the one that the Jews were longing for, God's appointed ruler who would come to usher in a new time of peace and prosperity, who would bring in the kingdom of God, who would do away with their oppressors, who would liberate the Jews from all that bound them and prevented them from following God freely. So Jesus comes as the Christ, the Messiah. And Mark says something further. He says Jesus is the Son of God. And by that term, Mark seems to be using Son of God in a very strong sense. Jesus didn't come as a mere messenger, but in some way, Jesus was divine. There's a sense in which when Jesus spoke, we were hearing God's words, says Mark. When Jesus acted, these were God's actions. That the finite God, the God who transcends categories, has somehow become finite. Somehow God, the divine nature, has become focused on a man, so that by looking at Jesus we can understand what God is like. So Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the one who was prophesied in the Old Testament, who would come and liberate the Jews from their enemies, and he's the Son of God, he is divine. And I think that Mark is wanting to depict Jesus in this way. I would sum up what I think is the main message of Mark's Gospel with these words. Jesus is God's appointed king, but a king like no other. Mark's very interested in the kingship of Jesus. He's come to bring in the kingdom of God. Mark chapter 4 presents the parables of the kingdom of God, what this new kingdom, this new world order looks like. This new world order that has God at the centre. He's God's appointed king, and as God's appointed king, Jesus possesses immense authority. And we see that authority in all of Jesus' confrontations with other authorities as the narrative unfolds. Mark's very interested in conflict. Jesus is always getting into skirmishes with others, conflict with others. He's getting into conflict with spiritual authorities and with earthly authorities. We see Jesus confronting the spiritual forces of evil. He's driving demons out of people, and they're no match for his authority. And as they leave people, they declare who he is. And then we see Jesus' authority too in the way that he takes on the religious rulers of his day. They hate Jesus. They hate him. And they're constantly trying to trick him. They're constantly trying to back him into a corner. But Jesus is outfoxing them at every turn. And then towards the end of the narrative, of course, they get Jesus exactly where they want him. They nail him, quite literally. They nail him, they manipulate the authority of state to hand him over, to be crucified. And then they got Jesus right where they want him to be, nailed to a cross. And it looks like they've won. But even then, Jesus turns the tables on his opponents. And he indicates that his authority is immeasurably greater than their authority, and this authority is demonstrated by his resurrection from the dead. So it's all about authority, it's about kingship, but he's a king like no other because he makes it clear to his disciples, and this is what we have the hardest time coming to terms with. He makes it clear that as God's appointed king, he must suffer and he must die. And Mark is constantly shifting the camera from Jesus to his disciples, back and forth. And the disciples come across as such nitwits. They're frail, they're vulnerable, they're perplexed, they're baffled, they're confused, they just don't get it. They don't understand what's going on. They're struggling to come to terms with the true nature of this kingdom that Jesus has come to inaugurate, to usher in. And the message is this, that those who belong to Jesus' kingdom, who follow this king, must follow in Jesus' footsteps. To be part of Jesus' kingdom means to suffer as he suffers, even to the point of death. And I think that Mark is inviting us, his readers, to identify profoundly with the disciples. They were so often fearful. We're so often fearful. They were so often perplexed and baffled at what was going on. We're so often perplexed and baffled. They messed up time and time again. They messed up. We messed up time and time again as well. Being asked to identify with this ragamuffin crew that are following Jesus around the place. But I think that although Mark is wanting to impress upon us how difficult it is to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, how peculiar and strange this life of the kingdom is, there's always hope for us. Because while Jesus' disciples don't get him, and ultimately they let him down, they flee from the scene. One of them is even involved in collaborating with Jesus' enemies, that results in Jesus being handed over to be crucified. While they let him down, Jesus remains ever faithful to his disciples. He remains committed to them. And he's constantly reiterating this call to come and follow me. Come and follow me. I'm not giving up on you. I know you don't get it, but the call is still there. The invitation is still there to come and be part of my kingdom, to come and follow me and be part of what I'm doing. And so Mark's gospel ends on a message of hope. There's that wonderful line right at the end of Mark's gospel where the tomb of Jesus has been discovered to be empty. There's this figure at the empty tomb, this man who tells the women who gather there that you need to go and tell the disciples and Peter, go and tell them this, that he is going on ahead of you and he will meet you in Galilee. And Mark ends, I think, on this message of hope. It's a very hopeful gospel. It's a gospel written to Christians who are struggling to come to terms with the harsh reality of what following Jesus looks like. It's so tough following Jesus. It results in hardship and pain and suffering and persecution. And yet in spite of all of that, there is hope. There is hope. Go and tell the disciples, he is going on ahead of you. He's going on ahead of you. He will see you in Galilee. He will see you in the place where he first issued his call to come and follow me. And Mark is wanting to say something about what it's like to follow Jesus. Jesus is constantly reiterating that call to come and follow him, and he goes on ahead of us. We may be baffled, we may be perplexed, we may be going through tough situations and circumstances, but he's gone on ahead of us. He will meet with us, and he will again reiterate that call to come and be part of his kingdom. It's hopeful. And it's for that reason I think Mark is a beautiful, wonderful gospel. I commend it to you. Why don't you read it?